Okay, this will be a relatively quick video, just looking at some of the limitations of using real GDP per capita as a measure of both material and then non-material living standards. So basically, the most common measure of living standards used by economists is GDP per capita, which is another word for income per person. It measures the average income per person within a nation, and therefore basically gives you an indication of the overall purchasing power on average that citizens within that country have. So in essence, for GDP per capita or income per person to increase, the overall production or GDP within a country must grow faster than population growth. So if GDP grows by 3%, population grows by 2%, then GDP per capita is increased. Once population grows faster than growth in GDP, the economy experiences a decrease in GDP per capita. If we're in a recession, that means GDP is going down, and it will generally mean, will always pretty much mean that GDP per capita goes down because population will be growing during that time as well. So in terms of some of the weaknesses of GDP per capita, while it is an okay measure of living standard, it has its weaknesses. So the first one is that a lot of what we call non-marketed goods and services are not included in the GDP figure. So when we say non-marketed, it means they're not sold through traditional channels for cash. So for example, do-it-yourself home production, so people working for themselves, so they might do their own painting or their own housework or their own gardening, or they might cut up their own firewood. This production, along with production in the cash economy, so people that have sideline jobs where they don't declare their income, all of that is not included in GDP figures and therefore understates our real material living standards. So as this is not, this production does not occur in any formal market, it cannot be accurately measured. So illegal or black market activity is another example. So the production of drugs, that might be like illegal DVDs and things like that, are not included, causing the value of Australia's GDP to underestimate the true living standards. And it generally underestimates by around 10 to 15%. In low-income countries and developing countries, it's often more than that because a lot of people grow their own crops, grow their own vegetables, and therefore that improves their living standards, but it's not included in GDP because they're not selling it for cash. So first one doesn't include non-marketed production. That includes do-it-yourself work, the cash economy, and illegal activity. Second one is that some production is what we call guesstimated. So the ABS actually imputes certain figures or guesses certain figures for certain products that are not sold in traditional ways. So this can include, for example, people that own their own farms, all the consumption that occurs on that farm by the people that own the farm. So they might, eat meat, they might eat the milk. None of that is sold through traditional marketplaces, and therefore they estimate that figure. It does get included, but that figure gets estimated. Another figure that gets included is the value of accommodation provided by houses by their owners. So you may remember from that video we watched earlier in the semester that this thing called imputed rent, where you live in the house, they estimate the amount of rent that you would have received, and that's an estimate, which means that it can be inaccurate. It's important to recognize these things aren't necessarily not included, but they are estimated or guesstimated rather than not included. So the value of consumption on farms as well as imputed rent are two good examples. Third one, GDP per capita does not take into account the way goods and services are shared or distributed. So having high economic growth and real high GDP does not necessarily mean that all citizens are better off. When we want to get a true indication of people's material living standards, we want to see how evenly that income is distributed as well. So if only a few people benefit from increased production and we have a really inequitable distribution of income, you wouldn't say the material living standards of all citizens have increased. So for example, a company like Facebook makes billions and billions of dollars per year, but that money is concentrated on a few people because they don't have a lot of employees. And that means that even though their GDP would increase because all the money they earn would be included in their GDP, it's going to lead to a more inequitable distribution of income, and it's only going to improve the living standards of a select few. So the way that revenue is divided will depend upon the economic system. If only workers' incomes are linked to areas of growth, so if growth is only concentrated in certain areas, so that might be, in mining or real estate, the increase in material living standards across the country may not necessarily be improving. And three other issues with GDP per capita. One, it doesn't take into account quality changes. So, for example, our material living standards may be better because of improved quality. It doesn't take into account rework or damage, just total production or income. So we've mentioned this in class. If there's a natural disaster, or if a lot of people are going to see psychologists, all of that would be included in GDP and GDP per capita, but it doesn't take into account the damage that's been done by natural disasters, or the fact that it's not probably good for our material living standards necessarily if more people feel they need to go see a psychologist. So it doesn't always provide a good indication of whether actual material living standards are improving, and it doesn't take into account the damage done in the economy. And lastly, it doesn't take into account what we call foreign remittances. So money earned overseas that's transferred back to a country by people in that country. So, for example, if Australians are working abroad, that doesn't get included in GDP per capita, but they're still Australians and therefore they still have a big impact on our living standards, particularly if some of that money is getting sent back home to their families. Right, in terms of real GDP per capita and non-material living standards, not as many here, but there's a lot of weaknesses of GDP per capita for non-material living standards. Firstly, it does not take into account extra production from activities that detract from our well-being. So, for example, if there's a natural disaster or a car accident, that's going to detract from our well-being, but our GDP may go up. So if you're in a car accident, for example, there's often people that, that often increases our GDP because people have to attend to the accident, and that can lead to increased production. It's bad for our overall living standards. Secondly, it doesn't take into account the amount of stress and the amount of leisure time that's often sacrificed to boost GDP. So if we're working 10, 12-hour days, that can lead to our GDP per capita increasing, but it may not necessarily lead to higher non-material living standards because people are more stressed. And often, lastly, higher GDP per capita can often be associated with stronger working hours, increased stress, and more family breakdowns, which is bad for our non-material living standards. And probably the main one, and the one that most people will quote, is that GDP per capita does not take into account environmental and other costs imposed on third parties, so that would grow from increased production. So often when we produce more, that has negative externalities associated with deforestation, environmental damage, climate change, poorer air quality. All of these things detract from our living standards, but they're not included in GDP figures. So excessive carbon pollution, for example, has led to global warming and climate change, which has had horrific impacts on countries through natural disasters like cyclones and droughts. They may also lead to rising sea levels, which can all have a negative impact on non-material living standards. So to summarise, GDP per capita is not very good for non-material living standards. It doesn't take into account environmental damage, climate change, deforestation. It doesn't take into account the loss of leisure time. It doesn't take into account the production that occurs, often resulting from harmful things, so things like car accidents or disasters. We'll look at alternative indicators of living standards in the next video.